thank you all for being here. I have to apologize in advance. I've been battling a kind of nasty cold all day, so if I seem a little low energy, please don't take it personally at all. But I think I can hack it through an hour and hopefully be helpful for you all. And I wanted to say just at the outset how grateful I am for the opportunity to get to talk to you all. This was a book that was in large part about the stories of people who are experiencing private equity directly. And so, as much as I want to share the information that I have with you all, I want to hear from you and learn from you all. So, I'm happy to talk for 20 minutes or so about sort of the basics around private equity generally and in the housing market. But I'd really love to hear your guys' experience, what you're seeing, and then think about what we can do to address this. So, let me start by sharing the presentation screen. Give me 1 second. And I guess I'll just ask Paul. Paul, can you see this? Okay, yeah. So uh, let me just start off with the basics on myself. I spent most of my career after law school at the Department of Justice in the antitrust division and spent a big chunk of it as focused specifically on private equity. And that was the opportunity, what gave me the opportunity to write the book and then sort of talk more publicly since I've left DOJ. I think as just sort of table stakes, it's sometimes helpful to talk about just what private equity is, because I know it's a term that a lot of us have heard, but it's often something that people don't know the specifics. And that's entirely understandable. I didn't know what private equity was until after I was pretty deep into researching it for the book project. But the basic idea is very simple. Private equity firms take a little bit of their own money, some investor money, and a lot of borrowed money to buy up companies. They then try to make financial or operational changes to the company and flip it for a profit a few years later. But the real magic trick of private equity is, I just said that they use some of their own money, some investor, and some borrowed money. When they borrow that money, it's not the private equity firm that's responsible for paying back the money. I see Theo nodding along. It's the company that gets bought that's responsible for paying back the debt, which is a lot like getting to use somebody else's credit card. It's sort of a financial magic trick. So private equity as an industry is enormous, and these statistics are a little old. Frankly, private equity has struggled in the past couple of years now that interest rates are rising. But in 2021, which was probably its most recent peak, um, firms were spending $1 trillion a year to buy up businesses. And the entire U.S. GDP is about $25 trillion. If you considered them with their portfolio companies, private equity firms would be the third, fourth, and fifth largest employers in the United States, behind just Walmart and Amazon. And yet, I think most people really haven't heard of these private equity firms, Carlyle and KKR and Blackstone. And in large part, that's because these firms don't really brand themselves. You don't hear about a Blackstone-owned emergency clinic, a KKR-owned veterinary practice, a Carlyle-owned nursing home chain. And yet, the chances are good that you are interacting with them virtually every day. I had this quote from this book, and I'll just read a portion of it, but it said, if you rented an apartment, you may have done so through a company owned by Blackstone. If you visited a doctor or rode in an ambulance, you may have been billed by a company owned by KKR. If you bought insurance, you may have done so through Apollo, or if you paid your student loans, you might have done so through a platinum equity company. Then I added at the bottom, the industry is quite literally right in front of you. The font used in this presentation and the font we used in the book is owned and licensed by a private equity portfolio company. So this is an industry that is essentially omnipresent. Oh, being told to go a little slower. I'll try. I'm sorry. I'm too used to being a lawyer and trying to fit in too many words too quickly. But I'll go a little slower here. So, when people hear about private equity, it's often in a negative light. And that's across industries. Private equity firm owned businesses are 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as businesses that aren't owned by private equity. Private equity and hedge fund owned uh, retailers lost an estimated 600,000 jobs in a 10-year period at a time when the industry as a whole added 1 million jobs. And private equity ownership is responsible for an estimated 20,000 premature deaths in nursing homes over a 15-year period. So it's a really extraordinary track record suggesting that private equity has bad results. And what I've been trying to argue is that it's not just a feature of the specific industries they go into. It's not even really a feature of the people that work in private equity. Rather, it's that we have three fundamental problems with the private equity business model, problems that are created by our laws and regulations that essentially mean that private equity firms can capture the upside when things go well, but walk away when they go poorly. And so, what do I mean by that? The first problem is that private equity firms tend to own businesses for just a few years, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years. And how long, if any of you have owned a business or worked at a business, you know intuitively how long you're involved in that business changes your perspective on it. If you're going to own a business for 20 or 30 years, you're going to think for the long term. How do we build our infrastructure, build our brand, help our employees, have a great reputation with our customers? If you're going to own a business for just 2 years, that's probably not going to be your perspective. You're going to be thinking about how can I cut costs as quickly as possible. So that's the first problem. Private equity firms tend to own businesses for just a few years. The second is one that was implicit in what we were talking about when we were just describing private equity, that private equity firms tend to load the companies they buy up with a lot of debt. And at the same time, they're extracting a lot of fees from these companies. So they get a management fee every quarter or every year for owning the business. They get transaction fees when the business does a big deal. And importantly, while the private equity firm only gets a portion of the profits, it gets all of the fees. And so that gives the private equity firm an incentive to extract money out of the business, even when it hurts that business's profitability. And then the last thing, and I think in some ways this is the most important part of private equity, although it's the least discussed, is that private equity firms are really good at insulating themselves from the financial and legal consequences of their actions. And what I mean by that is that private equity firms typically control the operations of the businesses they buy. They choose who runs them, they choose the board of directors and so forth. But when something goes wrong at that business, when somebody's injured or dies, when somebody's discriminated against, or when there's pollution, it's hard to hold the private equity firm responsible for that company's actions. And so that incentivizes really risky strategies for businesses because if things go well, the private equity firm prospers. If things go poorly, the private equity firm can just walk away. So those are the three basic problems with private equity, and let's look at how they apply to a specific business. I want to, yeah, I see Theo says, heads I win, tails you lose. That's exactly right. One of the case studies that I focused on was HCR Manor Care, which at the time when it was bought in 2007 was the second largest nursing home chain in the United States. It was bought by a private equity firm named Carlyle. Carlyle then loaded the company up with debt to finance the acquisition, extracted a lot of fees through transaction and management fees, and executed a lot of tactics that would be expected for somebody that plans to own the business for only a few years. For instance, it executed what's called a sale leaseback, where it required Manor Care to sell its real estate and then lease it back to itself. And you can kind of imagine that generates a quick hit of cash because you're selling the property, but now you're paying a lease every month for something that you used to own. At the same time, Carlisle cut staffing at the nursing home chains. And unsurprisingly, when you cut staffing at a nursing home chain, health code complaints spike. And in fact, one resident died at an allegedly understaffed facility because it was understaffed. Annie Sally had to go to the bathroom by herself. She slipped and hit her head on a bathroom fixture, and she died of subdural hematoma. When her family sued for wrongful death, Carlisle was able to get the case against itself dismissed by saying, we're not the technical owners of Manor Care. Rather, we just advise, yeah, David's laughing along at this. Yeah. Rather, they just advise a series of funds whose, limited partners through several shell companies own the nursing home chain. And they were able to get away from the lawsuit. That's just one example. Let me just go through a couple other ones because I think it shows other ways in which private equity firms are often able to benefit, even when their companies fail. Friendly's, I think, is a really interesting story. If any of you grew up on the East Coast, Friendly's is sort of a diner chain, sold ice cream and all this kind of stuff. Really had this inspiring origin story of these two brothers, Curtis and Presley Blake, I believe, who started it during the Great Depression, selling cones for 5 cents each. And they had this system where they would both work during the day, and then each one of them would take turns working through the night making the ice cream for the next business day. And they turned this little store into a national chain, which was eventually sold to a private equity firm. Um, Sun Capital. Now, Sun Capital, again, executed a lot of these familiar tactics, did a sale leaseback, as I recall, extracted various fees, cut staffing, and so forth. Um, Eventually pushed the company into bankruptcy. But they did this really interesting thing, which is, it's an oversimplification. I'm not a bankruptcy lawyer, but the general idea in bankruptcy is it's a little bit like flipping an hourglass. At the top, you have the people that own the bankrupt company, and then at the bottom, you have the lenders. And in bankruptcy, it kind of flips. The people that drove the company into the ground lose out, and then the lenders collect what they can. Sun Capital did this really interesting thing where it was both the owner and the largest lender of Friendlies. And so once it went into bankruptcy, it was able to flip the hourglass and sell Friendlies from itself to itself, which is sort of an odd maneuver. Why would you do that? Well, by going through the bankruptcy process, Sun Capital was able to push the pension obligations that Friendly's had onto a quasi-public organization called the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, which has to ensure, less responsible pension funds. Sun Capital was able to push those responsibilities off onto the PBGC, and as a result, it got to keep owning the business without the obligations that it had to retirees. There was a sort of similar story. In the interest of time, I won't go through it all, but Sun Capital did a very similar story with Marsh Supermarkets. Again, pushed the chain into bankruptcy, pushed off the pension obligations. Because those pension obligations weren't fully funded, I believe it was warehouse workers had their pensions obligations slashed pretty significantly. There was a separate pension fund for a handful of executives at Marsh. Those remain fully funded and were not affected by this sale. So let's talk a little bit about private equity and housing. The private equity industry has really gotten active in every part of housing in America. And I think, the most prominent part of this is single family rental homes. So what happened was after the Great Recession, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, essentially had control over millions of repossessed homes. And rather than selling off those homes individually, or better yet, just lowering the principal on people's mortgages so that people could stay in the homes that they were currently in, the Fannie and Freddie started selling off large tracts of homes, homes not just one at a time, but dozens or hundreds at once. And private equity firms started buying these at extraordinary rates. Before the Great Recession, there wasn't a single institutional investor that owned more than 1,000 homes. Blackstone, I believe in 2012 or 2013, bought more than 1,000 homes in a single day. Um, it really has changed the nature of home ownership in America because a lot of these homes were flipped into rentals. And so many people live in the same homes or live in the same neighborhoods as they once did, but they now rent rather than own them. It also means that private equity firms are often bidding against people when they're buying new homes. And so that's driving up the cost and making it hard for people, especially first-time homeowners, to get homes. And you're seeing localities try to address this. Relevant to our conversation today, private equity firms really have been interested in mobile homes specifically. Carlisle, which we were talking about earlier with the nursing home chain, bought up this mobile home park called Playa del Rey in the Bay Area, in Palo Alto or Mountain View. And as you can imagine, when you're talking about the Bay Area, homes are an absolute fortune. And the mobile home park was meant to be something of a pocket of affordability in the region. Well, after Carlisle bought up the mobile home park, this might be something that some of you have experienced. They raised lot rents, which not only meant that everybody was paying more each month, but it also decreased the equity value of everybody's home. So it was taking away people's incomes and people's wealth. Now, there was some reporting suggesting that Carlisle was trying to do this essentially to push people out of their homes, to make it unaffordable to live there so that they can convert it into more luxury housing or whatever it happens to be. They weren't successful, but they were able to sell the entire lot for a significant profit a few years later, and they were effective at fighting back local legislation to try to implement, sort of price controls for rents there. I think that highlights sort of an important part of why private equity is different than, sort of mom and pop landowners, because I don't want to suggest that, the mom and pop landowner that have maybe worked with, under before is so great. We've all had bad landowners. But the difference is mom and pop don't have the political influence that private equity firms like Blackstone and like Carlyle have. Blackstone helped to finance a $72 million campaign in California to block efforts by cities to extend tenant protections into single family rentals that existed in multifamily homes. And so I think it's with this concentrated economic power, it means not only that private equity firms are able to buy up a lot of homes and drive up their costs, but also to fight back the tenant and resident protections that people need. Just very briefly, a few more points. Um, you know, when we talk about private equity, we're typically talking about these purchases using borrowed money, what we call a leveraged buyout. But private equity firms are expanding beyond what we would call private equity. And in a lot of ways, are kind of becoming the one-stop financial shops that investment banks were before the Great Recession. So, there's this really interesting statistic that if you look at the number of people at the big investment banks who used to work at a private equity firm, and you look at the number of people at private equity firms who used to work at an investment bank, like 30% of people that work at Blackstone or KKR used to come from an investment bank, but only 2% of people are going in the other direction. And I bring up that statistic to tell you that the sort of intellectual energy of the finance industry is moving from investment banks to private equity firms. And that's because investment banks really changed how they were regulated after the Great Recession, and became much more regulated, whereas private equity firms remain something of a legal no man's land. It's much harder for the federal government to regulate them in any meaningful way. And so these private equity firms are taking on a lot of the business that the investment banks used to do, but they're a lot less regulated than they were in 2008. And obviously, we saw how 2008 turned out. I'll skip over some of the tough stuff about prison services, but I do want to talk about, how can we make private equity more responsible? Um, I think that the basic challenge that we have here, the basic thing that we're trying to accomplish, is to make private equity firms responsible for the consequences of their actions. If you can change that basic thing, then private equity firms are going to become a much more responsible part of our economy. They could even become a helpful part of our economy. I always try to say, I'm not against private investment. As long as somebody wants to start a factory or start up a new business, there needs to be somebody that's willing to put up the cash and take the risk to try to make things happen. But what we've created is a system where people can put up this cash, and if things go well, that's great. If things go poorly, they don't necessarily suffer. Now, there are things that can happen at the regulatory level in the Securities and Exchange Commission, at the IRS, the Federal Reserve. None of those things are going to happen in this administration. And in Congress, there really won't be much action. Bluntly, even if Democrats take control of the House or even took control of the Senate, the private equity industry is just enormously powerful at the federal level. But I don't think that we're hopeless. In fact, I actually think that progress is very much possible here, and it's going to start at the state and local level. What we need is legislation that essentially says if a private equity firm buys a business in our state or our city, they're allowed to do that. But if as a result there are massive layoffs or the company fails, we're going to make sure that the private equity firm and the private equity executives are responsible for their own actions. And if you do that, I think the private equity firms are going to behave a lot more helpfully and a lot less in an extractive way. I'll just close by saying that, I'm optimistic at some level because I've actually seen progress happen on specific issues. One of the private equity areas of activity is the prison phone industry. So prison phones tend to be owned by private companies, which jacked up costs so that it could cost, $15 or more for a $15 call, and this is for, prisoners who are making, 25 cents an hour. So it's just an extraordinary cost. Well, over a 20-year period, activists were able to pass legislation first at the city level. I see Brooke knows about this. First at the city level, I believe in San Francisco, in New York, then the statewide level in Colorado, and then finally at the federal level, actually passed legislation to make the FCC regulate these costs. And as a result, prison phones just aren't as attractive to private equity firms the way that they used to be. Brooke's saying the calls are free now. So, I say all that to say that we've seen progress happen before and we can make progress happen again. But it's going to happen at the state and local level, which is why I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to you all, because I think change is going to happen through organizations like yours. So I apologize for being a little low energy and a little fading tonight, but I really want to hear from you all. You can ask me questions. I'm happy to answer them, but I'd also just love to hear your stories, your experiences. I hope that this can be, not just a Q&A, but a real dialogue. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. And if you, Brenda, do you want to stop sharing and we can
Oh
see
yeah,
everyone and then, yep.
sure.
And then we'll have, yeah, thanks. Don, I see your hand. You want to go first?
Uh, Thank you, Mr. Ballou, for attending. This is a big moment for some of us. And two things. Do you see any progress at the state level yet for legislation to regulate, or have you even written any legislation yourself or proposed some that could be used and maybe a model state could try to implement it and then we could follow? And the second thing, I'd like to recognize that Esther Sullivan is in the audience. And she wrote the book Manufactured Insecurity. And I really be great if she could say a few words. I mean, that would be fantastic because the two of you together, I mean, wow. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. And it's bluntly sort of been on my to-do list for a year to try to write up some model legislation that organizations like yours can use. I honestly should just get my act together and do it, but I confess I've been I've been a little busy. But there actually has been really great legislation in specific areas that hasn't just been proposed, but has actually passed, and in particular on private equity in the healthcare industry. So, and this is another area where I think a small group of dedicated activists really had an impact. What they did is big mergers and acquisitions have to get approved by the Department of Justice and by the Federal Trade Commission. And companies actually have to submit materials to these agencies when the acquisitions are big enough. But a lot of healthcare acquisitions don't meet that threshold. And so what states are doing is they're passing legislation to say, hey, if a private equity firm is going to buy up a medical practice, you actually need to proactively notify the public and the state attorney general so that if we think it's going to be anti-competitive, we can challenge it, before it actually happens. And I think legislation's passed in Oregon. I think legislation may have passed in California, and there have been some others. So there's been really good progress on specific industries, but to Don's point, I think what we need next is a sort of more general model legislation that can go to sort of these sort of common issues that we're seeing with private equity. And I'd love to work with you all or with other groups to try to get that together.
I see Matt's hand up, but I did want to just say, since Don did the shout out to Esther, Esther, you want to say hello? Say anything?
I mean, I'm just happy to be here. I mean, Brendan, I loved your book. I loved your book. It was so helpful. I mean, I guess I will say something because I've always been curious about this point. It as Don so helpfully, thank you for that nice shout out, pointed out. I've been studying manufactured housing, though I know less than most of the people in this room who have the lived experience to know, to really, really know what's going on in these communities. But 10 years ago, it was like corporate owners were, and large corporate owners, multi-state corporate owners were buying up these communities, and it was problematic, certainly. But it seems as if as if it's nowhere near as problematic as these private equity firms. I mean, as Theo on this call can attest, who are willing to purchase these communities. And unlike corporate investors who saw them as a really lucrative source of passive income, I can invest as little as possible and still make a nice turnaround, right? These private equity firms, they don't even invest. In fact, I mean, as your book, that's why I'm so appreciative of it. It made it clear that these private equity firms can run companies, can profit while running companies into the ground. And so I'm just wondering if you have, because it's still always a question for me, like, how are these people turning profits on communities and allowing lots to just be vacant? They're not trying to get new homes in them and maximize their lot rents. They're letting infrastructure fail. They're even incurring fines. Maybe they're not paying. And so I'm curious, like, from the things that you know across the different industries, how is it possible that they're able to let these communities go into such a state of disrepair, even vacancy, and still turn a profit?
No, it's a great question, and it's something that I feel like I have the partial answer to, but it's like something that we all kind of need to figure out together. In fact, I'm trying to convince a judge in Delaware right now that private equity firms sometimes can make money by driving their businesses into the ground. So it's something that we need to educate folks about. I think it's a couple of different things. One, to go back to the metaphor about getting to use somebody else's credit card, you can make a lot of money from a business just through the financial engineering. So if you are not responsible for paying back the debt that you put on the company yourself, what you can do is you can buy up any sort of business. It could be a healthcare business or a veterinary practice or a manufactured housing park, and then just borrow a bunch of money that the park is responsible for paying. And then you do what's called a dividend recapitalization, which is you use that borrowed money to pay the private equity firm the dividend. And what that means is if the park eventually goes bankrupt, the park's responsible for paying back the debt. The private equity firm, which got the profit, isn't responsible for giving that money back in the bankruptcy process. So they can just kind of walk away. So sometimes just through financial engineering, you can make money from a business, even if it drives the business into the ground. I think that there's also just a sort of short-termism perspective on this, which is like, sometimes you can make a lot of money by just stopping investing in your product or in your property. And you can make a fair amount of money or increase your profitability over a 2-year period, even if that would hurt the profitability of the business of over a 10-year period or 20-year period. And then the last thing that I'll say is there's this really interesting division between the private equity firm making money and then the other investors that the private equity firm invests with making money. So, typically a private equity firm will work with endowments and pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And those other groups, what we call limited partners, will help put up some of the money to buy the manufactured housing park or the veterinary clinic. Now, what kind of gets interesting here is the private equity firm, all of them get a portion of the profits, but only the private equity firm gets those fees that we were talking about earlier. And what that means is the private equity firm specifically has an interest in extracting money from the business, even if it hurts the profitability, even if it hurts their other investors because of how they structured the deal. So it's not just that, excuse my language, private equity firms are screwing over the companies they buy sometimes. Sometimes they're doing it to their own investors.
Thank you. Matt, you've been super patient.
Yeah, I know you wanted to power along, but for a second there, you were talking about the private equity and the prison industrial complex, I believe. Yeah, this is something that's real important to me right now because I have a friend that just got sentenced. Um, 6 cents a minute for a phone call, a quarter for an email. Um, but the things in it, I mean, they keep the place cold and they give you crappy clothes. But you can buy nice thermals. The food is horrible, but you can get anything you want out of the commissary. And this just goes on and on and on, how they're nickeling and diming these prisoners and their loved ones. Um, so I don't know. I was just would be interested to hear just a few more minutes on the prison industry and private equity.
Yeah, and I don't want to pry too much, but if I can ask, where are you based and where is your friend going to be serving time?
Yeah, in Iowa, and
Oh,
it's
okay.
it's a state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so it's not private. Okay. Yeah, and I'm from Minnesota, so and we used to live in very southern Minnesota near La Crosse. So I'm familiar with Iowa pretty well. Um, yes, the prison industry I think has historically been really attractive for private equity firms for the simple reason that the folks that are the customers, people in prison or in jail, um, don't have alternatives. And so you can raise prices or cut the quality of care very significantly, and nothing will happen in terms of reducing your profitability or reducing your revenue. There are really extreme stories of this in the prison healthcare space, where some of the largest prison healthcare providers are owned by private equity firms. And they're just astounding stories of, a prisoner with weeping lesions on his body that are being untreated, about a female inmate having to give birth by herself in a cell because there wasn't staffing at the prison, about prisons having to take drug holidays because they just didn't have the drugs that they needed to administer and so forth. And to Matt's point about sort of conflicts of interest, you use the point about, it's cold atmospheres, but you can buy warmer clothes. You see that kind of conflict of interest, especially in prison food services, because sometimes it's the same company that both operates the cafeteria and the commissary. And so you have prison cafeterias where, I was going through news reports. There were multiple reports across multiple states of prison food service companies owned by private equity firms that that were serving boxes of meat that were literally labeled not fit for human consumption. Um, so it's a really tough situation that private equity has gotten so interested in this field. I will say again, one of the areas where I've seen the most progress by activists was in prison phone services. So I think that there is attention on that. If you're interested in getting involved in that issue, there's an organization called Worth Rises. It's run by this woman who used to be in the finance industry and is an absolute sort of rocket and is just enormously effective in this area. I think that there's good work that's being done there. I will say one of the other challenges that we've got is, for both good reasons and bad, it's often very hard for prisoners to have successful lawsuits against private companies that are involved in prisons. And so, you know, I was giving the example of nursing homes earlier. There's sort of even more hurdles for that in the prison space. So it's an area where I think litigation has been hard to use as a vehicle to make progress, and where I think activism and legislation at the state and local level is going to be the area where things change.
All right, Marge, you had your hand up?
Yes, first of all, at the risk of sounding like a girl, I bought 4 copies of your book and gave them all away. I got to buy another one for myself. I also have Esther's book. I've recommended it to a dozen people, the 2 best primers on the manufactured home industry in the world. And I've been approached by a couple of news reporters who know nothing about the private equity industry. So I'm trying to educate them. So I'm going to be sharing this tonight with them if I can. Also, I did work for Carlisle, the HCR Manor Care during all that stuff that went on.
Really?
And I witnessed with my own eyes the decline in care in the nursing homes. I had patients in nursing homes that was deplorable. And the,
Can you tell us more about it? You know, because I've
well,
read the reporting, but
yeah,
I've never met somebody that actually was working there.
yeah, worked for one of these crappy, yeah, dealers. What happened is they cut nursing home staffing because staffing is your biggest expense in nursing homes. It's all about the care to the levels where that proper patient care wasn't maintained. So you'd have one nurse per shift. You might have 25 patients that she had to cover. You'd have one aide per 12 patients. One person can't give 12 patients a bath every day. So wound care is going to happen. Slips and falls. Falls are the biggest thing that happens in nursing home. Floors are dirty. Patients aren't supervised. I would go in there to take care of my hospice patients who were residents in these homes. And holy cow, they'd be laying in wet briefs, developing bed sores because no one had been in there every 3 hours to turn them. That's a fact. And I know it's due to staffing. Those owners want their margins good so they can take the money out, and the staffing was deplorable.
Can I ask what state are you in?
Michigan,
Okay, got it. Yeah, you know, if reporters keep reaching out to you and you need somebody to give a quote about private equity, feel free to shoot them my way. I'm
may
happy to.
I?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's just my first name dot my last name at gmail.com. So just
You're,
Brendan dot
oh,
Ballou.
say that again, first name?
It's just Brendan BRENDAN dot
Okay,
Ballou
okay.
BALLOU at
At,
gmail.com. Yeah, feel free to read. Sometimes I'm a little slow in replying, but feel
that's
free to reach
okay.
out if there are any journalists that
Sure. Yeah, because I've been approached by two now at gmail.com.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, it absolutely, because they want to be educated on the subject. When I
yeah,
start telling about what we're dealing with in manufactured housing, they go, what? We didn't know that. How does that work? So
yeah.
thank you. Yeah, and that's been my experience. It's equally horrible in manufactured housing as well. I'm
Really.
dealing with a lady now who's living over an open sewer and we're trying to get the park owner to fix it, and it's just a nightmare. And we were
Really.
talking about a class action suit possibly. And you said there's not much of an avenue there, huh?
Did I say that there wasn't much of an
Well,
avenue?
you said that we have more luck working against these companies by doing activism
Oh,
and
I,
legislation.
you know,
Pardon, I
I
missed
was
it.
thinking about that specifically in the prison services industry.
Oh,
In
okay.
mobile home parks, there's a possibility there. So I'm starting a new law firm in January.
Ooh,
That could potentially help with this. The one challenge is because we're just starting out,
okay,
we can't work on contingency, so we'd need to figure out a way to
okay.
fund it. But if you guys, are talking and thinking about some of these lawsuits, more than happy to kind of brainstorm with you all because I think
Really?
one of the things that I really think we can try to accomplish here is if we can get the private equity firms into the case and keep them in the case, that's going to give us a ton of leverage, because
Okay.
they're not going to want a bunch of documents to be revealed. They're not going to want to have to be held responsible. If you can get them into the case, it's going to make a settlement much more likely.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can I just contact you at your email address if I
Yeah,
have any? Okay, thank
of
you.
course. Yeah, yeah,
Appreciate it.
And Don, I see your hand. I did want to just check, Mick put a nice long piece about private equity and evictions. Did you want to say anything about that?
All right. I haven't looked at the chat yet, so would Mick be willing to kind of summarize his point? Because I think I might be a few steps behind.
Mhm. Are you there, Mick? You want to?
So, if Mick doesn't want to talk, I'll just kind of read it out loud for others. So, it seems private equity-owned communities are more likely to be the worst with evictions. Evictions devastate lives, but it seems they are very profitable to those who use eviction as part of their business plan, since they are making money on the finance side too. Just and it goes on, but maybe I can just work off of that. In my limited experience, that's what I've seen as well, that private equity firms, not just in manufactured housing, but kind of across the board, are much more aggressive in with evictions than other kinds of owners, certainly mom and pop owners. I think that there are a couple reasons for that. One is I think sometimes the evictions are strategic with the goal of evicting a family or evicting a resident and then being able to raise rents on the next resident or being able to convert the property entirely, to, luxury housing or whatever it happens to be. So I think there's that aspect to it, where it's in their financial interest to push evictions. I also think, though, that sometimes it's not even in the private equity firm's interest to push these evictions, but it's just a nature of the size of the organization. Anybody that's, struggled with rent knows that, if it's a lot easier to talk to a mom and pop landlord than it is to talk to a gigantic management company. Because everybody kind of has an interest in you staying a resident. And, if you're going to pay the rent 2 days late or 3 days late, it's a lot better to just say yes to that and then keep the person in the place than it is to have this formal policy where they're immediately evicted. But I think because of the size and bureaucracy of some of these companies, they push residents out, even if it's in everybody's interest not to, just because of the bureaucracy. So I completely agree it's a huge problem, and it's not even necessarily a problem that the private equity firms benefit from every time.
And just to add to that, sometimes it's also about pushing a family out of an older home,
Yeah.
getting rid of the older home and bringing in a newer home, or just taking the home themselves. Don, I see your hand.
Yeah, thank you again, everyone. I lived in a vulture capitalist-owned manufactured housing park for 6 years. And yes, they would economically or legally evict people. And what astounded me was that often, the residents didn't know how to voluntarily foreclose or go through the procedures. And so the manufactured, the predatory owner could then confiscate the homes and flip them. And people were, some of them were basically on the street and their home was being taken over by these people and then flipped for profit. That kind of thing, the lawlessness and the lack of ethics, I think is what astounded everyone. It seemed like they always were testing the limits of how much they could get away with to see if they would be sued or not. And even though this owner owned like 40 parks, if only 1 out of 10 parks ever sued them, they probably wouldn't lose enough money to not still be making a profit on the other 9. And it was just, I had never seen anything like this before. I mean, did anybody else have any comments like that?
I'd be curious for other people. I have some thoughts, but I'd be really curious to hear other people's reactions or experiences.
Well, they didn't maintain the infrastructure, for instance. They let it lack, and we started to have sewage spills at a park that was once a 5-star park. And things like that were, began to show that they just really tried as much as they could to squeeze and not invest. And one of the regional managers was actually caught by HCD, California's housing department, and prosecuted for selling homes that were not habitable by HUD standards. So we just had them. I mean, it was like the mafia had come in to our park.
I see Theo's got his hand raised. I don't know if maybe we want to hear from him and then we can talk about it.
Yep.
Thanks for being here, Brendan. Thanks for writing the book. And kudos to your old boss's boss, Leda Khan, who's still in the fight.
Yeah.
But I think the eviction thing is multifaceted, and it ties in with their whole plan of making the judgment-proof shell entities that a lot of people don't seem to understand. We also found that there was this reticence. There's almost like, oh, well, we trust businessmen, this reticence to really go after these guys. And so I started using the metaphor of the Pee Wee Herman defense, which is what they use. They basically say, why don't you make me on every single thing that a regulatory agency wants to do? They ran up against my township building inspector, and I never saw anybody basically tell the building inspector to to go, somewhere. And the even the township and the county and the state were not prepared for this level of defiance, to the point where nobody had ever been prosecuted for operating a mobile home park without a license. These guys let the park get to the point where, we forced them to lose their license because they had radioactive elements in the water, and the water was just terrible. We had outages almost several times a month. But the evictions all ties into that, because this is all the game of, it's a financialization game, even with these mobile home parks, because if they raise the rent, or if they sell, all this ties into their loan to value at the bank. So then they can multiply by 600 times $50 a month and say, see, the property's worth this much more, and borrow more money on it and keep the value of the LLC essentially underwater with debt. So they're judgment proof, which also makes it kind of not interesting for lawyers to want to take the cases, because there's such a short statute of limitations. You can't really prove the fraud. And they just, it's like an eviction mill is how they operate it.
Totally. And to connect it to Don's thing, I think one of the things that has made so many private equity firms so successful is how much they're willing to invest in litigation. I I was really surprised. I included in the book, there was um, a fairly small dispute over how much was owed to a pension fund in a private equity owned company. And I mean, in the scale of sort of pension fund sizes, it was $4.5 million, which is a lot of money, but for pension funds, that's not going to change the world for them. But the private equity firm ended up fighting over that $4.5 million for, I think it was 11 years. They went up on to the courts of appeal twice on the stuff. I'm sure that they spent more than that on their legal fees, but it was the principle of the thing. They wanted to develop good case law, and they were able to, because they were willing to spend the money. And it's a little bit like playing poker or something like that. They just know they've got a bigger stack of chips and are willing to be a bully on a lot of this stuff. So I think they've been successful at using sort of legal resources to their advantage.
Yeah, they filed over 30 motions in the misdemeanor case. And then finally they went back and they told the prosecutor, oh, you can't fine us more than 25K because that's the limit of the court that you're suing us under.
Yeah.
So it just, even before that, they said, well, we'll just file Chapter 7 and walk away from any fines you want to hit us with, because they were up to $300,000 in fines.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this goes into the nursing home stuff. What I've been told from lawyers that litigate on nursing home things is that they've been very good at spreading their assets across many different companies and having very complicated structures. So, like you're saying, you're getting these entities that nominally have no money, but then there are 5 other entities that might have some of that money, but they're making themselves very hard to find. And for a plaintiff side lawyer that maybe doesn't have a lot of time or money to investigate, and certainly for a state court judge that really doesn't have time to like dig into the weeds on this, it's very hard to do that kind of like forensic accounting and financial analysis. So it's really tough.
Yeah, the
And
state
just to
police
touch,
had even gotten a warrant for all their emails. They filed all this to have a special master appointed. They hired the biggest criminal defense attorney in this part of the state. Probably spent over 100K. The partner, the top partner, took the case.
Wow.
Yeah. So just one more thing to tie back to what Don was saying. I know there are people in this room, a couple of people in this room who are in Bloomington, Illinois, where a Texas firm bought 5 parks and implemented leases that didn't comply with Illinois state law. And when one of the, when they got into a legal case with one of the residents, and the legal aid folks said, here are the 13 ways that your lease doesn't comply with state law, their first response was, how about we deal with 6? And then the lawyer said, well, no, there are 13 ways that this, and drags on and on and on. And finally they said, okay, we'll fix it for you, but just for you, not for the other 1,200 people who live in parks in the, it was, so it's that sort of, constant dragging.
Can I have any of you guys had issues with arbitration agreements? Have you been forced to sign arbitration agreements as a condition of being in the park? No? Okay. Some people are nodding yes, some people are nodding no. Okay.
I
That's
see,
helpful.
I think I saw a hand that was just an actual physical hand from, is that
Yeah.
Francis? You gonna go on mute? Yep, is that a question there?
I'm here, yes.
Yes.
I was at the last meeting, I think 2 weeks ago. I'm from Florida. I'm in a park with about 200 homes. And I'm interested in this investment, this equity tracker that we've been talking about. What is the purpose of the tracker? And can it help us with, I don't know, taking them down? We are owned by Legacy P3, which is part of Blackstone. And what we have happening right now is we've been in mediation / now we're waiting on a court date for 2 years and talking 50,000 that we've raised, trying to pay for lawyers. We're on our third lawyer. Anyway, long story short, they're evicting people and then tearing down the homes, but not replacing the homes. So we're all thinking that maybe there's condos in their future or something, because they did buy the park in 2018 for $22 million, and now it's only worth 10 million. So they've lost money as far as value is concerned. So
And Francis, I'm sorry, can you tell me the name of the park again?
Lakeside Village in Leesburg, Florida.
Okay.
We have a sister park in Leesburg, which is Ridgecrest. They didn't go to mediation, and of course they didn't get a chance to say anything about their rental increases, but we have.
And the complaint is primarily about rent increases and then destroying properties and not replacing them. Am I understanding?
Right, and turning down buyers. So when somebody's trying to buy a home, they go through 7 or 8 people who are interested, and then the property manager keeps finding reasons to not accept those buyers. But the main question I started with, does the tool help us in any way? That investment, the equity tracker, who's buying these properties and what are they doing with them?
So Brendan, I don't know how much you've dealt with the PESP private equity tracker tool that they created in manufactured housing.
No, this is news to me, so I think
Okay.
you're better positioned to answer the question than I am. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know that and I'm also not with Private Equity Stakeholder Project, although I have to give them a plug. They've been an amazing partner. And my sense is that tracking tool was more about making the private equity's ownership of manufactured housing visible to policymakers, to media, and sort of helping us to tell the story as we're organizing. I don't know I haven't dug into the tool as a research tool that helps us, actually get deeper into the ownership structure. Although for those of you who are interested, I saw that it was posted in the chat earlier. We're going to be doing a workshop on December 10th with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project on how to research your park, how to research your corporate owners.
That's great.
Yeah. Marge, I did see that you had your hand up again. Just before we go, I want to just double check if there are any other folks who haven't spoken or asked yet and wanted to get their voices in. And if not, go ahead, Marge, ask your question.
Well, no, I think he covered it. He answered
Okay.
it. So you give that time to someone else. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful.
Great. Anything else? Well, Paul, Don, you were going to add something else?
Could you comment on what Elizabeth Warren appears to be doing along with other Congress people or senators to try? She seems to be very concerned about this private equity thing.
Yeah. So she's been introducing a bill for the past few sessions, the Stop Wall Street Looting Act, which I think is a really good idea, and I think has been good for sort of pushing public understanding on these issues. And Warren and her staff are really in the weeds on policy stuff in a way that's really good. And so if there's a future Democratic administration, I hope that she pushes good nominees into sort of the executive branch to do this stuff. Candidly, I just, I think that there are a number of members of Congress that are really on the right side of this issue and are banging the drum. Her, Chris Murphy, some other ones. But because of the money that private equity has, I think it's going to be very hard to make progress in Congress. But that's not to say that progress can't happen. I think progress can happen in the executive branch. I think it can happen in the courts. And I especially think that it can happen at the state and local level. So what I think Warren is doing is really important in raising awareness, but I think change is probably going to happen through other institutions.
Right. Do we have any other last comments?
Paul,
Any other last? Yes, David.
I wanted to take and say, as far as people trying to contact their attorney general's office, the big problem there is these equity firms have not broken any laws.
Hmm.
Most of the time, they haven't broken a law.
Yeah.
So the AG can't get involved until somebody breaks a law. And so
Yep.
that's, uh, our group, they brought it up many times, go to the AG, and we try to tell them, you're flogging a dead horse.
Yeah. Can I ask what state you're in?
Pennsylvania.
Okay, got it. Well, so I definitely think that there are ways to sort of go after firms for some of the actions that they're doing here. So even a firm that's not breaking any explicit laws, if they are extracting money from the company in a way that's going to drive the company to the ground, the private equity appointed directors might be breaching their fiduciary duties to the companies that they're serving. And might be one way to get at some of them. So I agree with you. One of the challenges that we've got is that private equity firms, are oftentimes following the law. But I also think that we need to be creative in how we're thinking about applying these laws in a way that I think largely because lawyers just haven't been trained in how private equity firms are organized, that we're just not thinking as creatively yet as we could. So I completely agree that there's a problem, but I also think that you guys should keep pushing because I think creative and dedicated state AGs and local prosecutors, like if you can educate them about what's going on here, they can start thinking more creatively and take action. For my health, I should probably run in a little bit, but I know Marge has her hand raised too.
Oh, I was just going to comment on that real quickly. That's what we're looking at doing with this park. We've been going through the MCL, the Michigan Compiled Law Code, to find something we could take to the Attorney General that they're in violation of, the sewer and water and foundation in that park. So that is, and it's kind of uncharted territory. I can't find a lawyer anywhere that knows anything about this stuff. And we're
Yeah,
trying to figure out how to move forward with it, but we're gonna keep trying. We're not
that's
giving up.
great.
So,
That's fabulous. Well, please keep me in the loop, whether or not it's something my new firm can help with or not, at the very least, I'm happy to try to point you guys in the right direction. But Paul, unless there's anything else, I just wanted to say, my
Yeah.
genuine thanks to all of you for taking the time here. It really means a lot to me to see organizations like yours that are actually doing the community building and doing the organizing work because like that is where change is going to happen. So yeah, I'm very grateful for the time that you all took today.